I never thought he'd actually do it. Not really. Not after everything we'd been through. Not after all the years I'd spent believing that love, or at least loyalty, would keep us tethered together, even when the storms came. But that morning the world felt ordinary. I woke up to the familiar hum of the city outside our window, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps steady, predictable, almost comforting. I remember thinking, as I brushed my hair in the mirror, that maybe things would get better. Maybe the tension that had been simmering between us for months would finally break, and we'd find our way back to each other. But hope is a fragile thing, and sometimes it shatters in the most unexpected ways. We left the house in silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel like a question you're too afraid to ask. He drove, eyes fixed on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I tried to make small talk about the weather, about errands, about anything that might break the ice, but every word seemed to bounce off an invisible wall between us. The argument started small, as they always do. A careless comment about my spending, a sigh when I mentioned my mother's birthday, a roll of his eyes when I asked if he'd be home for dinner. I felt the old ache in my chest, the one that comes from loving someone who's already halfway out the door. I tried to hold it together, to keep my voice steady. But the words spilled out anyway, words about feeling invisible, about being taken for granted, about the loneliness that had crept into our marriage like a slow, relentless tide. He didn't shout. He didn't even look at me. He just kept driving, his jaw clenched, his silence louder than any argument we'd ever had. I could feel the anger rising in me, hot and sharp, but underneath it was something colder, a fear I couldn't quite name. We were halfway across town when he finally pulled the car over. It was a quiet street, lined with old trees and empty sidewalks, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. He put the car in park and turned to me, his eyes flat and unreadable. "Get out," he said. At first I thought he was joking. I laughed, a brittle sound that died in my throat when I saw the look on his face. He reached across me, opened the passenger door, and gestured for me to leave. "Get out," he repeated, his voice low and cold. "Take your time. Do whatever you want." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when he'd soften and say he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that he was just angry. But there was nothing in his eyes, no regret, no love, not even anger, just emptiness. I looked down at my lap, searching for my purse, my phone, anything that would anchor me to the world I knew. But my bag was gone. I must have left it at home, or maybe he'd taken it, I couldn't remember. My hand shook as I stepped out of the car, the door closing behind me with a final echoing thud. The air was colder than I expected. I wrapped my arms around myself, watching as he shifted the car into gear. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind. I thought he might roll down the window, call my name, tell me to get back in. But he didn't. He just drove away, the taillights fading into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. I stood there stunned, the world spinning around me. I felt exposed, like every stranger passing by could see the cracks in my heart, the humiliation burning on my skin. I wanted to scream, to run after him, to beg him to come back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, caught between disbelief and despair. The street was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I looked down at my hands, empty and useless, and wondered how I'd gotten here, how a life built on promises and shared dreams could unravel in a single, brutal moment. I tried to remember the last time he'd looked at me with love, the last time he'd touched my hand without pulling away. But the memories felt distant, like someone else's story. All I could feel now was the sting of betrayal, the sharp edge of abandonment cutting through everything I thought I knew. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I told myself I'd be fine, that I was strong, that I didn't need him. But the truth was, I had no idea what to do next. I had no money, no phone, no way to call for help. I was alone, truly alone for the first time in my life. As I stood there, watching the world go on without me, I realized that this was the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped being someone's wife, someone's afterthought, and became something else, someone who would have to find her own way no matter how lost she felt. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the ache in my chest, the cold on my skin, and the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in the silence. And as I took my first uncertain steps down that empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling that my story was only just beginning. I stood on the curb, the world suddenly too big and too quiet, as if the city itself had paused to watch me unravel. For a moment, I just stared at the spot where the car had been, half expecting it to reappear, for him to come back and say it was all a mistake, a cruel joke gone too far. But the street remained empty, and the only thing that returned was the wind, tugging at my hair and making me shiver. I reached instinctively for my pockets, searching for the familiar weight of my phone, the comforting jingle of my keys, the soft leather of my wallet. Nothing. My hands came up empty, and a cold wave of panic washed over me. I patted myself down, checked every pocket, even the lining of my coat, but there was nothing. No phone to call for help, no money for a cab, not even a single coin to buy a bottle of water. I was stripped of everything that tethered me to safety, to home, to the life I'd always taken for granted. I looked around, hoping to see a familiar face, someone who might recognize me, someone I could trust. But the street was lined with strangers, each one moving quickly, eyes averted, lost in their own worlds. I felt invisible, as if I'd slipped through the cracks of my own life and landed somewhere I didn't belong. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing and shoving each other, their voices echoing off the buildings. I thought about asking them for help, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? That my husband had left me here with nothing? That I was stranded, helpless, and humiliated? The thought made my cheeks burn with shame. I tried to steady my breathing, to push down the rising tide of fear. I told myself I was strong, that I could handle this, that I'd figure something out. But the truth was, I'd never felt so small, so powerless. Every step I took felt uncertain, every decision fraught with risk. I was used to having a plan, to knowing what came next. Now all I had was the sound of my own footsteps and the ache of betrayal echoing in my chest. I wandered down the block, scanning the storefronts for a payphone, a cafe, anywhere I might find a moment's respite. But the world had changed while I wasn't looking. Payphones were relics, and every cafe seemed to require a purchase just to sit down. I pressed my face to the glass of a bakery, watching as people laughed and sipped coffee, their lives untouched by the storm that had just swept me away. I thought about going inside, about asking for help, but the humiliation was too much. I could already imagine the looks, the whispered judgments, the pitying smiles. I didn't want to be someone's charity case, didn't want to explain how I'd ended up here, abandoned and alone. So I kept walking, my pride a thin shield against the cold. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was stranded, with no way to contact anyone, no money to get home, no idea what to do next. The city that had always felt familiar now seemed hostile, every face a stranger, every door closed to me. I tried to remember if I knew anyone nearby, someone I could walk to, someone who might let me use their phone. But my mind was blank, fogged by fear and exhaustion. I thought about my parents, my friends, but they all lived miles away, and even if I could get to them, what would I say? How could I explain that the man I'd built my life around had simply discarded me, as if I were nothing? A sudden gust of wind made me pull my coat tighter around me, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled in my bones. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never known before. I'd always prided myself on being independent, on handling whatever life threw at me. But this was different. This was abandonment, pure and simple, and it left me hollowed out, stripped of everything I thought I could rely on. I sat down on a bench, my legs trembling, and tried to gather my thoughts. I needed a plan, some way to get out of this mess, but every option seemed impossible. I couldn't call a cab, couldn't pay for a bus, couldn't even buy a cup of coffee to warm my hands. I was trapped, not by walls or locked doors, but by the absence of everything I'd always taken for granted. A woman walked by, her arms full of groceries, and for a moment I considered asking her for help. But the words wouldn't come. I watched her disappear around the corner, her life moving forward while mine stood still. The humiliation was overwhelming. I thought about all the times I'd judged others, all the times I'd assumed that people who ended up in situations like this must have done something to deserve it. Now I knew better. Sometimes all it takes is one cruel decision, one moment of weakness, and your whole world can come crashing down. I wiped away a tear, angry at myself for crying. I didn't want to be weak, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd broken me. But the fear was real, and it pressed in on me from all sides. What if I couldn't find help? What if I was stuck here, invisible and forgotten, while he went on with his life as if I'd never existed? I forced myself to stand, to keep moving. I couldn't afford to sit still, not when every minute brought me closer to desperation. I told myself that I'd find a way, that I'd survive this, even if I had no idea how. As I started walking, my steps slow but determined, I realized that I was truly alone. No safety net, no one to catch me if I fell. Just me, and the long, uncertain road ahead. But I had no idea how much worse it would get. I walked for what felt like hours, my feet aching in shoes that suddenly seemed too tight, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The city, once a backdrop to my daily routines, now loomed around me like a maze of locked doors and shuttered windows. I kept telling myself that someone would help, that all I needed was a little kindness, a little luck. But as the sun climbed higher and the crowds thickened, hope began to slip through my fingers. The first person I approached was a middle-aged man in a suit. Standing outside a coffee shop, scrolling through his phone, I hesitated, rehearsing my words, trying to sound calm and reasonable. "Excuse me, sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but He didn't even look up. He just shook his head, muttered something about being late and walked away, leaving me standing there with my apology hanging in the air. I tried again with a young woman waiting at a bus stop, her headphones tucked into her ears, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I waved, desperate for her attention, but she glanced at me with a flicker of annoyance and turned away, pulling her bag closer to her side. I could almost hear her thoughts. Don't get involved. Don't make eye contact. Don't risk it. The more people I approached, the more invisible I felt. Some ignored me completely. Others offered tight, uncomfortable smiles before hurrying off. A few looked at me with open suspicion, as if I were trying to scam them, as if my desperation were a trick. I tried to explain, to keep my voice steady, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. My husband left me here. I just need to use a phone. I just need to call someone. But no one wanted to listen. No one wanted to get involved. I wandered into a small convenience store, hoping the clerk might let me use the phone behind the counter. The man eyed me warily as I entered, his gaze lingering on my empty hands, my anxious face. "No loitering," he said before I could even speak. I tried to explain, but he shook his head, his voice flat and final. "Sorry, can't help you." I left, the bell above the door ringing out my failure. The city felt colder now, the crowds thicker, the noise sharper. I watched as people laughed with friends, carried shopping bags, held hands with loved ones. I wondered if any of them had ever felt this alone, this desperate. I wondered if they would remember me later, the woman with the lost look in her eyes, or if I would fade from their memories as quickly as I'd appeared. As the afternoon wore on, my hunger grew sharper, my throat dry from the effort of asking, explaining, pleading. I sat on a bench in a small park, watching a group of children chase each other through the grass. Their laughter was bright and careless, a sound from another world. I closed my eyes, trying to remember the last time I'd felt that free. A man sat down beside me, his clothes rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He smiled, revealing a row of crooked teeth. "You look lost," he said, his voice low and rough. I nodded, unsure whether to trust him, unsure if I had a choice. He leaned closer, the smell of alcohol sharp on his breath. "You need a place to stay? I know somewhere." His hand brushed my arm, lingering a moment too long. Panic surged through me. I stood up quickly, mumbling a thank you, and hurried away, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked, the weight of his attention clinging to me like a shadow. I ducked into a crowded street, grateful for the anonymity, but the fear lingered, sharp and insistent. I tried to remind myself that not everyone was dangerous, that there was still good in the world. But every encounter chipped away at my faith, Every rejection a reminder that I was truly on my own. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my husband had left me? That I had no money, no phone, no proof of who I was? I imagined the questions, the skepticism, the pity. I couldn't bear it. As the sky began to darken, the city's edges grew sharper, the shadows longer. I felt exposed, vulnerable, a target for anyone who cared to notice. I kept moving, afraid to stop, afraid to draw attention. I passed a group of teenagers loitering outside a convenience store, their laughter turning to jeers as I hurried by. I kept my head down, my pace quickening. I found myself on a quieter street, the noise of the city fading behind me. The houses here were older, their gardens overgrown, their windows dark. I paused, unsure of where to go next, my body aching with exhaustion. I leaned against a lamppost, fighting back tears, willing myself not to give in to despair. A car slowed as it approached, headlights cutting through the dusk. For a moment I tensed, ready to run, but the car stopped a few feet away. The window rolled down, and a woman's face appeared, framed by a halo of dark hair. She looked at me, really looked, her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that kindness still existed, but after a day spent in the shadows, hope felt like a dangerous thing. She waited, patient, her gaze unwavering. I took a shaky breath, the fear and exhaustion finally breaking through my defenses. I need help," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She nodded, her expression softening. "Get in. Let's get you somewhere safe." As I reached for the door handle, 1,000 doubts raced through my mind. Was this another mistake? Was I trading one danger for another? But I had no choice. I was out of options, out of hope, and so, with my heart pounding and my faith in humanity hanging by a thread, I climbed into the car, not knowing that this woman would change everything. The inside of the car was warm, the faint scent of lavender and something sharper, maybe leather, maybe perfume, filling the air. I sank into the passenger seat, my body trembling with exhaustion and nerves. The woman glanced at me, her eyes sharp but not unkind, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, charged with questions neither of us was ready to ask. She pulled away from the curb, her hands steady on the wheel. The city lights flickered past the windows, painting her face in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. I watched her from the corner of my eye, trying to read her expression, to guess at her intentions. She looked to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and a face that was both striking and hard to pin down pretty, but not in a way that invited easy trust. "Rough day?" she asked, her tone light but edged with something deeper. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "You could say that." She nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "You don't have a phone, do you?" I shook my head, embarrassed. "No, I don't have anything, actually." She glanced at me again, her gaze lingering a moment longer this time. "No purse, no wallet, no keys?" I shook my head again, feeling the humiliation rise in my cheeks. "Nothing." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the road. "Did someone do this to you?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to lie, to say I'd lost my things, that it was all a misunderstanding. But something in her voice, in the way she asked, made me want to tell the truth. "My husband," I said quietly. "He left me, just left me." She didn't react the way I expected. No gasp of shock, no flood of sympathy. Instead, she nodded, as if she'd heard it all before. "Men can be cruel," she said simply. We drove in silence for a few blocks, the city slipping away behind us. I realized I had no idea where we were going, no idea who this woman was or what she wanted. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady drumbeat of fear and hope. I glanced at the door, wondering if I could open it and run if I needed to. But I was too tired, too desperate, and besides, where would I go? She seemed to sense my unease. "You don't have to worry," she said, her voice softer now. "I'm not going to hurt you, I know what it's like to be left with nothing." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of deception. But all I saw was a kind of weary understanding, a sadness that felt familiar. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, a small, sad smile. Because someone once helped me, and because I know how it feels to be invisible. We drove on, the city giving way to quieter streets, the houses growing farther apart. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, just a little. Maybe, I thought, there was still some kindness left in the world. But then her questions began gentle at first, then more probing. How long were you married? Did he ever do anything like this before? Do you have family nearby? Each question felt like a test, and I answered as honestly as I could, though I kept some details to myself. I didn't want to seem too broken, too lost. She listened carefully, her eyes never leaving the road. You're stronger than you think, she said at last. But you need to be careful. People will take advantage if you let them, I nodded, unsure if she was warning me about herself or the world in general. We pulled up in front of a small house on a quiet street, the porch light casting a warm glow on the front steps. She turned off the engine and looked at me, her expression unreadable. You can stay here tonight, she said. I have a spare room. You can get cleaned up, get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next. I stared at her, unsure what to say. Gratitude and suspicion warred inside me. Could I trust her? Did I have a choice? The thought of spending another night on the street, of facing more strangers and shadows, was too much to bear. She seemed to sense my hesitation. You don't have to decide right now, she said. But you look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. Thank you, I managed, the words feeling both too small and too big. She smiled again, this time with a hint of warmth. Come on, let's get you inside. As I followed her up the steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. I didn't know if I could trust her, didn't know if I was making another mistake. But for the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt a flicker of hope. And then, as she unlocked the door and ushered me inside, she made an unexpected offer, one that would set everything in motion. The house was small but inviting, the kind of place that felt lived in, with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of something baking lingering in the air. I stepped inside, my nerves still taut, but the warmth of the space wrapped around me like a soft blanket. The woman, her name was Evelyn, she finally told me, led me to the kitchen, where a kettle was already whistling on the stove. Sit, she said, gesturing to a worn wooden chair. You look like you could use some tea and a bite to eat. I sat, my body heavy with exhaustion, and watched as she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. She set a plate of buttered toast and a bowl of soup in front of me, the simple meal feeling like a feast after the day I'd had. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, the warmth spreading through me and easing the ache in my chest. Evelyn sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her own mug. For a while we didn't speak. The silence was comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of the house settling and the distant hum of traffic outside. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to melt, replaced by a cautious sense of safety. After a while, Evelyn broke the silence. You don't have to tell me what happened, she said gently, but if you want to talk, I'll listen. I hesitated, unsure where to begin. The words felt heavy, tangled up with shame and anger and grief. But something in her eyes, steady, patient, kind, made me want to try. So I told her, haltingly at first, about the argument in the car, about being left on the street with nothing, about the humiliation of asking strangers for help and finding only closed doors. She listened without interrupting, her expression never changing, never judging. When I finished, she nodded, as if she'd expected every word. I know how that feels, she said quietly. To be left behind, to have everything you thought you could count on ripped away in a single moment. I looked at her, surprised. Did it happen to you too? She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Not exactly the same, but close enough. My husband, well, ex-husband now, he left me with nothing but a pile of debts and a house I couldn't afford. I found out he'd been cheating for years, and when I confronted him, he just walked out, took the car, the savings, even the dog. I spent months thinking it was my fault, that I'd done something to deserve it. Her words settled over me like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my pain. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I didn't feel so alone. I saw myself in her story, saw the same wounds, the same struggle to make sense of a life that had been turned upside down. "How did you get through it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn shrugged, her eyes distant. "One day at a time. Some days I barely made it out of bed. Other days I was so angry I thought I'd explode. But eventually, I realized I had a choice. I could let what he did define me, or I could start over. It wasn't easy. I lost friends, family turned their backs, but I found new people, new strength. I learned to trust myself again. Her honesty was a gift, one I hadn't known I needed. I felt something shift inside me, a tiny spark of hope flickering to life. If she could survive, maybe I could too. We talked late into the night, sharing stories of heartbreak and resilience, of small victories and setbacks. I told her about my childhood, about the dreams I'd set aside for my marriage, about the ways I'd lost myself trying to keep someone else happy. She listened, nodding, sometimes offering a word of encouragement, sometimes just letting the silence speak for itself. For the first time, I felt seen not as a victim, not as someone to be pitied, but as a woman who had been hurt and was still standing. The loneliness that had wrapped itself around me all day began to loosen, replaced by a fragile sense of connection. Eventually, Evelyn stood and stretched, her movements slow and deliberate. "You should get some sleep," she said. "There's a spare room down the hall. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." I followed her, my eyelids heavy, my body aching for rest. The room was small, with a single bed and a faded quilt, but it felt like a sanctuary. I sat on the edge of the bed, unsure how to thank her for her kindness. Evelyn lingered in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. "You're stronger than you think," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But tomorrow you must decide what comes next." "No one else can do it for you," I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. As she closed the door behind her, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. For the first time since my husband had left me on that street, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. And as I drifted off to sleep, Evelyn's words echoed in my mind, "You're stronger than you think." Morning light crept through the curtains, painting the small room in soft gold. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything was normal, that I would wake up in my own bed, in my own home, with the familiar sounds of my old life waiting for me. But as I sat up, the ache in my body and the heaviness in my heart reminded me that nothing was the same. I was a guest in a stranger's house, my world reduced to the clothes on my back and the memories I carried. Evelyn greeted me in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a gentle smile. "You don't have to rush," she said, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I thanked her, my gratitude too big for words, and promised I'd be in touch. I needed to see my home, to face whatever waited for me there. I needed to know what was left. The bus ride across town felt endless. Every stop, every jolt, every unfamiliar face pressed in on me, reminding me how much had changed in just 24 hours. I stared out the window, rehearsing what I'd say if I saw him, if he answered the door, if he tried to explain. But as the bus neared my street, my confidence began to crumble. I was afraid not just of him, but of what I might find. I walked the last few blocks, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. The neighborhood looked the same tidy lawns, the same children's bikes left on the sidewalk, the same old dog barking behind the fence. But as I turned the corner and saw my house, a cold wave of dread washed over me. Something was wrong. The curtains were drawn tight, the porch swept clean, but the welcome mat was gone. I climbed the steps, my breath shallow, and tried the door. It didn't budge. I tried again, jiggling the handle, but it was locked, dead-bolted. I reached for the spare key hidden in the flower pot, but it was gone too. My heart sank. I knocked, the sound echoing in the empty air. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, my fear turning to anger. I pressed my face to the window, peering inside. The living room was empty, stripped bare. The couch, the photos, the little lamp I'd bought on our honeymoon gone. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the porch, the reality settling over me like a shroud. He'd erased me, Not just from his life, but from our home. Every trace of me, every memory, every piece of the life we'd built together, gone. I felt hollow, as if I'd been scooped out and left behind, a ghost haunting the place I used to belong. A neighbor walked by, her eyes flicking over me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I tried to smile, to act as if everything was fine, but the tears burned hot and fast. I wiped them away, furious at myself for letting him see me like this, for letting him win. I circled the house, searching for another way in, but every window was locked, every door secured. I called his name, my voice cracking, but there was no answer. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. I sat on the back steps, my mind racing. Where were my things? Had he thrown them away, sold them, given them to someone else? The thought made me sick. I thought about the letters I'd saved, the jewelry my mother had given me, the little box of keepsakes from our first years together. All gone, as if I'd never existed. I pulled out my phone. No, I didn't have one. I had nothing. I was locked out of my own life, cut off from everything that had once made me feel safe. The humiliation was sharp, but underneath it was a deeper, colder anger. He hadn't just left me, he'd destroyed me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to take. But as I sat there, staring at the empty house, something inside me shifted. I thought of Evelyn's words, of the strength she'd found in her own darkest moments. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who'd built a life from nothing, who'd survived heartbreak before, who'd always found a way to keep going. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when he wanted me to disappear, to fade away without a fight. I stood, brushing the dust from my jeans, and squared my shoulders. I would not let him erase me. I would not let him win. I walked away from the house, my steps slow but steady. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what I would do next. But I knew one thing: I would fight. I would find a way to reclaim what was mine, to rebuild my life from the ashes he'd left behind. He thought he could break me. He thought he could take everything and leave me with nothing. But he was wrong. I was still here, and I was just getting started. I left my house, no, his house behind. The image of its empty rooms and locked doors burned into my mind. I walked for blocks, numb and directionless, until I found myself back at Evelyn's. She opened the door before I could even knock, as if she'd been waiting for me. I didn't have to say a word. She just stepped aside and let me in, her presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't as alone as I felt. We sat at her kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, painting golden stripes across the worn wood. I told her everything: the empty house, the missing things, the way he'd erased me from our life. She listened, her face set in a grim line, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "He's hiding something," she said, her voice low and certain. "Men like that don't just walk away. They cover their tracks." I wanted to argue, to believe that the worst was already behind me, but something in her tone made me pause. I thought about the way he'd acted in the weeks before he left, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in our finances. I'd chalked it up to stress, to work, to anything but what it really was. Evelyn stood and disappeared into her bedroom, returning with a battered laptop. "Let's see what we can find," she said, her eyes sharp with determination. "Do you know any of his passwords?" I nodded, rattling off the ones I remembered. We tried them one by one until finally we were in. His email was a mess of receipts, travel confirmations, and messages from names I didn't recognize. Evelyn scrolled through, her fingers flying over the keys, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. It didn't take long. There were emails from a woman named S. Long, intimate messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I read them in silence, my heart pounding, the words blurring together in a sickening rush. He'd been seeing her for months, maybe longer. He'd told her things he'd never told me about his dreams, his fears, his plans for the future. Plans that didn't include me, but it didn't stop there. Evelyn dug deeper, opening bank statements and credit card bills. There were withdrawals I couldn't explain, transfers to accounts I'd never seen, thousands of dollars gone without a trace. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized how deep his betrayal ran. He hadn't just left me, he'd stolen from me, siphoning off our savings while I was busy trying to save our marriage. Evelyn's jaw tightened as she pieced it together. "He's been planning this for a while," she said. "He wanted you out of the way so he could take everything." I stared at the screen, the evidence laid out in black and white. Every lie, every secret, every moment I doubted myself, it was all right there. I felt sick, but beneath the nausea was a growing sense of clarity. He hadn't just abandoned me. He'd orchestrated my downfall, step by step. We printed out everything we could find: emails, bank statements, receipts. Evelyn showed me how to save copies to a flash drive, how to back up the files in case he tried to erase them. She was methodical, calm, her experience with her own ex-husband, turning her into the ally I never knew I needed. As we worked, I remembered little things that hadn't made sense at the time. The way he'd insisted on handling the bills, the sudden arguments about money, the new credit cards that arrived in his name. I'd trusted him, believed that marriage meant sharing everything. I'd been so wrong. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes fierce. "You have to protect yourself now. This isn't just about heartbreak, it's about survival. You need to talk to a lawyer, freeze your accounts, make sure he can't take anything else." The thought of fighting him terrified me, but I knew she was right. I couldn't let him get away with this. I couldn't let him erase me from my own life. We spent hours combing through every detail, piecing together the story he'd tried so hard to hide. The more we found, the angrier I became, not just at him, but at myself for not seeing it sooner. "But Evelyn wouldn't let me dwell on regret. He's a master manipulator," she said. "He wanted you to doubt yourself. That's how men like him win." As night fell, we took a break, sitting in the quiet kitchen, the weight of what we'd uncovered pressing down on us. I felt raw, exposed, but also strangely empowered. For the first time, I had proof. I had a story to tell, one that couldn't be dismissed or denied. Evelyn poured us each a glass of wine, her hands steady. "You're not the first woman he's done this to," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last. But you can be the one who fights back." I nodded, the resolve settling in my bones. I wouldn't let him win. I wouldn't let him destroy me. But just as I started to feel a glimmer of hope, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face going pale. She handed it to me, her hand shaking. It was a message from an unknown number. A photo of me, taken that morning as I stood outside my empty house, looking lost and broken. The caption was simple: "You should have stayed gone." My blood ran cold. He was watching me. He knew I was digging, knew I was fighting back. The fear I'd managed to push aside came rushing back, sharper than ever. Evelyn locked the doors, her movements quick and practiced. "He's trying to scare you," she said, her voice tight. "Don't let him." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in more danger than I'd realized. If he was willing to go this far, what else was he capable of? We sat in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on us. I stared at the photo, at the woman I barely recognized, and wondered how much more I could take. I thought I'd seen the worst of him. I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. But the worst secret was yet to come. The next morning, I woke to the sound of quiet voices in the kitchen. For a moment, I panicked, thinking he had found me, that the nightmare was starting all over again. But as I crept down the hallway, I heard laughter, soft, knowing, the kind that only comes from people who have survived the same storm. Evelyn was there, of course, but she wasn't alone. 2 other women sat at the table, mugs of coffee cradled in their hands, their eyes bright with curiosity and something else, recognition. Evelyn introduced them as Marcia and Lila. Both had stories that echoed my own. Marcia's husband had drained their accounts and left her with nothing but debt. Lila's partner had manipulated her for years before vanishing with her savings. They spoke of betrayal and heartbreak, but also of survival, of the ways they'd rebuilt their lives from the ashes. Their presence was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't the only one who had been broken and remade by someone else's cruelty. We sat together, sharing stories, trading advice. Marcia, a paralegal, explained the legal steps I needed to take. Freezing joint accounts, documenting everything, contacting a lawyer who specialized in cases like mine. Lila, who had started a support group for women in similar situations, offered resources, safe places to stay, therapists who understood, even a list of sympathetic police officers who wouldn't dismiss my fears. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt a sense of agency returning. I wasn't just reacting to what he'd done. I was making choices, taking steps to protect myself. The women didn't sugarcoat anything. They told me it would be hard, that there would be days when I'd want to give up, that the legal system could be slow and unforgiving. But they also promised that I wouldn't have to face it alone. Evelyn watched me closely, her eyes full of pride. "You're not the same woman who walked into my car," she said. "You're stronger now. You have us." The contrast was stark. Just days ago, I'd been utterly alone, invisible in my pain. Now I was surrounded by women who understood, who had walked the same path and come out the other side. Their strength became my own, their hope a lifeline I clung to. We spent the afternoon making a plan. Marcia helped me draft a letter to the bank, freezing our joint accounts and alerting them to possible fraud. Lila showed me how to document every interaction, every threat, every piece of evidence. Evelyn called her lawyer friend, who agreed to meet with me the next day. The women even helped me set up a new email address and a secure place to store my documents, so he couldn't track me or erase my progress. But it wasn't just about the legal battle. They taught me how to protect myself emotionally, too. Lila led us in a simple breathing exercise, reminding me to ground myself in the present, to let go of the shame and blame that had weighed me down for so long. Marcia shared a mantra she repeated every morning. "I am not what was done to me. I am what I choose to become." Their words settled into my bones, steadying me. I realized that I didn't have to carry the burden of his betrayal alone. There was power in sisterhood, in the quiet solidarity of women who refused to be broken. As the sun dipped low, painting the kitchen in golden light, we reviewed the plan one last time. I would visit the lawyer, file a police report, and begin the process of reclaiming what was mine. It was daunting, but with their support, it felt possible. Evelyn squeezed my hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "This is just the beginning," she said. "He wanted you to disappear, but you're still here. You're fighting back." I nodded, a fierce determination rising in my chest. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was taking control. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by something stronger: hope. As I prepared to leave for my first meeting with the lawyer, the women gathered around me, their presence a shield against the darkness. I looked at each of them, gratitude swelling in my heart. I wasn't alone. I had allies in the shadows, women who had turned their pain into power. We had a plan, but would it work? I didn't know, but for the first time, I was ready to find out. With my head held high and my heart steady, I stepped out the door, taking the first step of my counterattack. The day I confronted him, the sky was a hard, cloudless blue, the kind of day that should have felt full of promise. Instead, my heart hammered in my chest as I walked up the courthouse steps, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hand. I could feel the weight of every woman who had helped me, every story of survival and strength, pressing at my back, urging me forward. I wasn't just doing this for myself anymore, I was doing it for all of us. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Patel, met me at the entrance. She had a calm, steady presence, the kind that made you believe anything was possible. "You're ready," she said, her voice low and certain. "He's not expecting this." "Remember that," I nodded, swallowing my fear. I'd spent so long being afraid of him, of his anger, his disappointment, his cold, calculating silences. But now, as I stepped into the echoing halls of justice, I felt something shift inside me. I was done being afraid. We waited in a small, windowless room, the air thick with anticipation. When he finally arrived, he looked just as I remembered, impeccably dressed, his hair perfectly in place, his expression bored and dismissive. He barely glanced at me, as if I were a minor inconvenience. A problem he'd already solved, but when Ms. Patel handed him the stack of documents, emails, bank statements, photos, messages, his composure faltered. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting from me to the lawyer and back again. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have nothing." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I have the truth. And I have people who believe me." He scoffed, but I could see the cracks forming in his mask. Miss Patel laid out the facts, her words precise and unyielding. She explained how he'd siphoned money from our accounts, how he'd hidden assets, how he'd tried to erase me from our life. She spoke of the emotional abuse, the manipulation, the calculated cruelty. Every word was a blow, and I watched as he struggled to keep his composure. "You can't prove any of this," he spat. But his voice wavered. "We already have," Ms. Patel replied, sliding another document across the table. "And if you try to retaliate, we'll go public. Your employer, your family, your friends, they'll all know exactly what you've done." He stared at her, then at me, his face pale with rage. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the empty house, the locked doors, the way he'd left me on the street without a second thought. I remembered the fear, the humiliation, the nights I'd spent wondering if I would ever feel whole again. I straightened my shoulders, letting him see the woman I'd become, the woman he never thought I could be. "You don't get to control me anymore," I said, my voice clear and strong. "You don't get to decide who I am." The meeting ended with a flurry of threats and denials, but the damage was done. He knew I had the upper hand, and for the first time, he was the one scrambling for control. Ms. Patel assured me that the legal process would take time, but we had everything we needed to protect my interests. I left the courthouse feeling lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. But the confrontation wasn't just about the law. Word spread quickly through friends, family, even social media. The story of what he'd done, the evidence I'd gathered, the strength I'd found in the face of betrayal, it all became public. People who had once doubted me reached out with apologies and support. Women I barely knew sent messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories of survival. The isolation I'd felt for so long was replaced by a chorus of voices, a community of women who refused to be silenced. He tried to fight back, of course. He sent angry emails, left threatening voicemails, tried to turn mutual friends against me. But every time he lashed out, I stood my ground. I had the truth on my side, and I had allies who refused to let me fall. Evelyn, Marcia, and Lila were with me every step of the way. They celebrated each small victory, reminded me to take care of myself, and never let me forget how far I'd come. We met often, sharing updates, strategizing, and laughing in ways I hadn't thought possible just weeks before. Their friendship was a lifeline, a reminder that I was never alone. There were setbacks, of course. The legal process was slow and exhausting, full of paperwork and court dates and endless waiting. Some days the fear crept back in, whispering that maybe he would win after all. But every time I felt myself slipping, I remembered the woman I'd become, the woman who had faced her worst fears and refused to back down. One afternoon, as I sat in Evelyn's kitchen, she handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with the words, "She who rises from the ashes." I slipped it onto my wrist. The cool metal a reminder of everything I'd survived. "He never expected you to fight back," Evelyn said, her eyes shining with pride. "But you did. And you're winning." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my bones. I was winning not just in court, but in life. I was reclaiming my story, my dignity, my future. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished. There were strange calls in the middle of the night, unfamiliar cars parked near Evelyn's house, a sense of being watched that I couldn't quite explain. I tried to brush it off, to focus on the progress I'd made, but the unease lingered. One evening, as I left the lawyer's office, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. The handwriting was unmistakable his. The message was short, chilling in its simplicity. "This isn't over." My hands shook as I read it, the old fear threatening to take hold. But I refused to let it. I took a deep breath, crumpled the note, and threw it away. I wasn't the woman he'd left on the side of the road. I was stronger now, surrounded by people who believed in me, armed with the truth. He never expected me to fight back. But he wasn't done with me yet. Just when I thought I could finally breathe, that the worst was behind me, the ground shifted beneath my feet once more. It started with a phone call from the bank, a cold, clipped voice informing me that my accounts had been frozen due to suspicious activity. I tried to explain, to ask for details, but the woman on the other end only repeated the same rehearsed lines. My heart pounded as I hung up, a sick feeling blooming in my stomach. I checked my email and found a flood of notifications, missed payments, declined transactions, warnings about overdue bills. It was as if my entire financial life had been wiped clean overnight. Panic clawed at my chest. I called Miss Patel, my lawyer, who promised to look into it immediately. "He's trying to scare you," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Don't let him. We'll get to the bottom of this." But even her confidence couldn't quiet the fear that had begun to take root. I'd worked so hard to reclaim my life, to build something new from the ruins he'd left behind. Was it all about to slip through my fingers again? The next blow came swiftly. A friend from work called, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, but have you seen what he posted?" My blood ran cold as I opened my social media. There, for everyone to see, was a carefully crafted story, one that painted me as unstable, vindictive, even dangerous. He'd posted private messages out of context, twisted my words, and shared photos that made me look unhinged. The comments were already piling up, some from people I knew, others from strangers eager to judge. I felt exposed, raw, as if my skin had been peeled away for the world to see. I tried to respond, to defend myself, but every word I typed felt futile. The more I tried to explain, the more desperate I sounded. He was always one step ahead, always twisting the narrative to suit his needs. I watched as friends unfollowed me, as colleagues grew distant, as the support I'd fought so hard to build began to crumble. The final straw came when I received a letter from my landlord. "Due to recent concerns regarding your reputation and financial stability, we regret to inform you that your lease will not be renewed." I stared at the words, numb with disbelief. In a matter of days, he'd managed to unravel everything I'd rebuilt: my finances, my reputation, my sense of safety. I felt myself slipping, the darkness closing in, threatening to swallow me whole. I sat on Evelyn's couch, staring at the wall, unable to move. The women who had become my lifeline gathered around me, their faces etched with worry. "He's desperate," Marcia said, her voice fierce. "He knows he's losing, so he's trying to destroy you any way he can." Lila hugged me, her arms warm and strong. "You're not alone. We'll get through this together." But their words felt distant, muffled by the roar of my own fear. I thought about everything I'd lost, everything I'd fought for, and wondered if it had all been for nothing. Was I doomed to keep reliving this nightmare? To keep losing pieces of myself every time I tried to stand up? I closed my eyes, searching for the strength I'd found before. I remembered the woman I'd become, the one who had faced him in court, who had built a new life from nothing, who had found allies in the darkest places. I tried to hold on to that version of myself, but she felt so far away. The night stretched on, heavy and endless. I replayed every moment, every decision, every word I'd spoken. I wondered if I should have stayed quiet, if I should have let him win, if fighting back had only made things worse. The doubt was suffocating, a weight pressing down on my chest. But then, in the quiet darkness, I heard Evelyn's voice steady, unwavering. "You're stronger than this. He wants you to break, but you won't. Not now. Not after everything you've survived." Her words cut through the fog, a lifeline pulling me back from the edge. I realized that I had a choice. I could let him destroy me, or I could fight back again. I could reach out, ask for help, trust the women who had stood by me when no one else would. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn's number. My voice shook as I spoke, but I forced myself to say the words. "I need help. I can't do this alone." She didn't hesitate. "I'm here. We all are. And we're not letting him win." As I hung up, a flicker of hope sparked in my chest. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if I would ever truly be free of him. But I knew one thing: I wasn't alone, and I wasn't done fighting, not yet. The morning after I reached out to Evelyn, I woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen, soft, determined, and full of purpose. For a moment I lay in bed, letting the warmth of their presence seep into my bones. The despair that had threatened to swallow me the night before was still there, but it was quieter now, edged out by something new, resolve. When I joined them, Evelyn was already on the phone, her voice calm and authoritative as she spoke to a lawyer about the false accusations and financial sabotage. Marcia was at the table, typing furiously on her laptop, compiling evidence to counter the lies he'd spread online. Lila handed me a mug of tea, her eyes kind and steady. "We're going to fix this," she said, and for the first time in days, I believed her. We spent the morning rebuilding my case, piece by piece. Every document, every message, every bank statement was carefully organized and backed up. Marcia helped me draft a statement for social media, one that told my side of the story without stooping to his level. "You don't have to defend yourself to everyone," she reminded me. "But you can reclaim your voice." Evelyn reached out to her network, connecting me with a women's advocacy group that specialized in cases like mine. They offered legal advice, emotional support, and even a crisis fund to help cover my rent while I sorted out the mess he'd made of my finances. Their kindness was overwhelming, a reminder that there were still good people in the world, people who believed in justice and second chances. As word spread about what had happened, unexpected allies began to emerge. A former co-worker messaged me privately, sharing that she'd seen my ex manipulate others in the past and offering to write a character reference. A neighbor I barely knew stopped me on the street, pressing a business card into my hand. "If you need a place to stay or just someone to talk to, call me," she said, her voice gentle. Even online, the tide began to turn. Women who had been through similar ordeals reached out with messages of support and solidarity. Some shared their own stories, others simply offered encouragement. Each message was a thread, weaving me back into the fabric of a community I'd thought I'd lost. With every step, my confidence grew. I remembered the woman I'd been before the betrayal, the one who was resourceful, resilient, and unafraid to speak her mind. I realized that she was still there, buried beneath the rubble, waiting for me to find her again. Evelyn watched me closely, her pride evident in every glance. "You're doing it," she said one afternoon as we sat together, reviewing the latest legal documents. "You're taking your life back." I smiled, the truth of her words settling deep inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was rebuilding, stronger and wiser than before. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had faced the worst and come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. As the days passed, I prepared for the final confrontation. With the help of my newfound allies, I gathered every piece of evidence, every witness, every resource I could find. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would stand my ground, how I would refuse to let him twist the truth one more time. The night before the hearing, Evelyn sat beside me, her hand warm on mine. "No matter what happens tomorrow, remember this: you are not alone. You never were, and you never will be." Her words echoed in my heart as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the future I was fighting for. I thought of all the women who had helped me, all the strangers who had become friends, all the pieces of myself I had reclaimed along the way. I wasn't alone anymore. I was ready, and as the sun rose on the day of the final confrontation, I stood tall, my heart steady, my spirit unbreakable. I was prepared to face him one last time, and this time, I would not back down. The courthouse was a world unto itself, marble floors echoing with footsteps, the low hum of voices, the sharp scent of paper and nerves. I walked through the doors with my head high, my heart pounding, but my resolve unshaken. Evelyn was by my side, her presence a steady anchor. Marcia and Lila waited in the gallery, their faces shining with pride and hope. I wasn't alone. I carried the strength of every woman who had stood with me, every ally who had helped me piece my life back together. My husband, no. My ex-husband was already there, flanked by his lawyer, his expression a mask of arrogance and impatience. He barely looked at me as I took my seat, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to make it this far. He hadn't expected me to fight. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began, each side presenting their case. His lawyer tried to paint me as unstable, vindictive, unreliable. They referenced the social media posts, the rumors he'd spread, the financial chaos he'd orchestrated. For a moment, I felt the old fear rise up, threatening to choke me. But then I remembered Evelyn's words, the chorus of support behind me, and I found my voice. With Ms. Patel's guidance, I laid out the truth calm, clear, and unflinching. I presented the evidence, the emails, the bank statements, the messages that revealed his manipulation and deceit. I showed the judge the timeline of his actions, the calculated way he'd siphoned money, changed the locks, and tried to erase me from our life. I read aloud the threats he'd sent, the note he'd left on my car, the photo he'd taken of me outside my own home. The courtroom was silent as I spoke, every eye fixed on me. I felt exposed, but also powerful. I was no longer the woman he'd left on the side of the road. I was someone who had survived, who had fought back, who refused to be silenced. His lawyer tried to object, to twist my words, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward, my former co-worker, the neighbor who'd seen him moving my things out of the house, even a bank manager who testified about the suspicious transfers. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of his lies. When it was his turn to speak, he faltered. The arrogance slipped away, replaced by anger and desperation. He tried to blame me, to claim I was making it all up, but the judge was unmoved. The truth was too clear, the pattern too obvious. The verdict came swiftly. The judge ruled in my favor, ordering the return of my assets, the reversal of the fraudulent transactions, and a formal apology for the defamation he'd spread. My reputation was restored, my finances secured, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of his control lift from my shoulders. As the gavel fell, a wave of relief washed over me. I looked at Evelyn, at Marcia and Lila, at Ms. Patel, and saw tears in their eyes. We had done it. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, the air crisp and clean. Reporters waited on the steps, eager for a statement. I spoke briefly, choosing my words carefully. No one deserves to be erased. No one deserves to be silenced. If you're out there, feeling alone, know that you're not. There is help. There is hope. The messages poured in women from all over the city. Some I knew, most I didn't, reaching out to thank me, to share their own stories, to offer support. I felt the power of community, the strength that comes from refusing to be broken. But as the day wore on, a new question began to form in my mind. What about Evelyn, the woman who had stopped her car, who had taken me in, who had guided me through the darkest days of my life? She had been my savior, my mentor, my friend. But there was something about her, something unspoken, unfinished. That evening, as we sat together in her kitchen, I turned to her. "Why did you help me?" I asked, my voice soft. "You barely knew me. You could have driven away." Evelyn smiled, her eyes distant. "Because someone once helped me. Because I know what it's like to be left with nothing. And because I saw myself in you." I reached for her hand, gratitude swelling in my chest. "I don't know how to thank you." She squeezed my fingers, her grip strong. "You already have. You fought back. You found your voice. That's all I ever wanted for you." But as I looked at her, I sensed there was more to her story, something she hadn't shared, a secret she still carried. I wanted to ask, to understand, but she only smiled, her gaze drifting to the window, where the last light of day was fading. Justice had been served. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, my future. But as I watched Evelyn, I knew there was still unfinished business questions left unanswered, stories left untold. And as the night settled around us, I realized that my journey wasn't over. There was still more to learn, more to heal, more to discover, not just about myself, but about the woman who had saved me when I needed it most. The days after the trial passed in a blur of relief and gratitude. I was free from his shadow, free from the fear that had haunted me for so long. My life was my own again, and I was determined to fill it with hope, with purpose, with the kind of strength I'd found in the women who had stood by me. But even as I celebrated, a quiet curiosity tugged at me. Evelyn's kindness had saved me, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a story she kept hidden behind her gentle smile. One evening, as we sat together in her living room, the question I'd been holding finally slipped out. Evelyn, why did you really stop for me that night? Why did you help me when you could have just driven away? She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze searching. The room was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. At last she sighed, her shoulders softening. I suppose it's time you knew the truth. She stood and crossed to a small cabinet, pulling out a faded photograph. She handed it to me, her hands trembling just a little. In the picture, a younger Evelyn stood beside a man I recognized instantly, my ex-husband. My breath caught in my throat. I met him years ago, she said quietly. Long before you. I was young, naive, and desperate for love. He swept me off my feet, promised me the world. But it was all a lie. He took everything from me, my savings, my confidence, my sense of self. When I finally found the courage to leave, he made sure I had nothing. I lost my home, my friends, even my family turned their backs. I started over, just like you did. Alone, afraid, but determined to survive. The room seemed to shrink around us as her words sank in. I stared at the photograph, seeing my own pain reflected in her eyes. You were his first victim, I whispered. She nodded, her expression bittersweet. I thought I was the only one. For years I carried the shame, the anger, the regret. I built a new life, but I never forgot what he did to me. When I saw you on that street, I recognized the look in your eyes. I knew what had happened before you even said a word. Tears pricked at my eyes as I reached for her hand. You saved me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You gave me hope when I had none left. Evelyn squeezed my hand, her grip warm and steady. You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to start. I wanted to break the cycle, to make sure he couldn't destroy another woman the way he destroyed me. And you did more than survive. You fought back. You won. The truth of her story reframed everything. Her strength, her wisdom, her unwavering support, they were born from the same pain I had endured. She hadn't just been my rescuer. She was my mirror, my proof that healing was possible, that the past didn't have to define the future. We sat together in silence, the weight of our shared history settling between us. I realized then that our stories were not just about betrayal and loss, but about resilience, about the power of women to lift each other up, to turn pain into purpose. Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. There are more of us than you think, she said softly. Women who have been broken and rebuilt, who have learned to trust again, to love again, to live again. We find each other in the most unexpected places, and when we do, we make sure no one is left behind. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my heart. I thought of Marcia and Lila, of the women who had reached out to me online, of every survivor who had turned her scars into strength. We were a sisterhood, bound not by our wounds, but by our will to rise. As the evening faded into night, I hugged Evelyn tightly, gratitude and love swelling in my chest. Thank you, I whispered. For everything. She smiled, her voice gentle and sure. Pass it on. That's how we heal. That's how we win. And as I left her house that night, I carried her story with me, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. There is always hope, always help, always another woman ready to reach out her hand and say, I see you. I've been there, and together we will rise. There are moments in life when you realize you've crossed a threshold, that the person you were is gone and someone new has taken her place. I felt that shift in the quiet mornings, sipping coffee in my own apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows. The world felt different, brighter, wider, full of possibility. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had chosen to do in response. I spent time reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the nights spent doubting my own worth, they were still part of me, but they no longer held power over my days. Instead, I saw them as proof of my resilience, the foundation on which I was building something new. I had learned to trust my instincts, to set boundaries, to speak up for myself. I had learned that asking for help was not a weakness, but a strength. Evelyn became more than a friend, she became a mentor, a guiding light. We met often, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. She encouraged me to join her in the support group she'd started, a circle of women who had all survived their own storms. Each week, I listened to their stories, offered my own, and watched as hope flickered to life in the eyes of women who had once felt as lost as I had. I found purpose in helping others. I volunteered at the women's shelter, offering a listening ear, a warm meal, or simply a reminder that they were not alone. I spoke at community events, sharing my story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of survival and sisterhood. The more I gave, the more I healed. The more I reached out, the more I realized how many women were waiting for someone to say, "I believe you. I see you. You matter." My life was no longer about him or what he had taken from me. It was about the future I was creating, one filled with friendship, purpose, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have survived the worst and come out stronger. I started taking classes, exploring new interests, and dreaming again. I let myself imagine love, not as something to be feared, but as something I deserved, on my own terms. There were still hard days, of course. Healing is not a straight line. There were moments when the old fears crept in, when the scars ached, when I wondered if I would ever truly be free. But I had learned to reach out, to lean on the women who understood, to let myself be vulnerable without shame. Evelyn and I became partners in hope. Together, we expanded the support group, reaching more women, building a network of resources and safe spaces. We celebrated every victory, no matter how small, a woman finding a job, another securing her own apartment, someone simply making it through the day without giving up. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of our shared strength. Looking back, I saw how far I had come, not just from the day he left me on the side of the road, but from the years I had spent doubting my own worth. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, my future. I had learned that empowerment is not a destination, but a journey, a series of choices, big and small, to keep moving forward, to keep believing in yourself, to keep reaching for the light. If you're reading this, if you're facing your own storm, know this: you are not alone. There is a community waiting to welcome you, to lift you up, to remind you of your strength. Reach out, share your story. Let yourself be seen. Healing begins the moment you decide you deserve more. I invite you to join us, to share your journey, to find your voice, to become part of a sisterhood that refuses to be broken. Together we rise, together we heal, and together we create new beginnings, one empowered step at a time.